Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our study on life after death. Today we are in Lesson 7, looking at two troubling chapters. When it comes to a study of the subject of life after death, there are many false beliefs and doctrines that have just grown out of a misunderstanding of God's words. And so in this lesson, we look at two chapters that are commonly misunderstood and misapplied. We're looking at Revelation chapter 20 and Matthew chapter 24. Starting with the book of Revelation. This book is one of the most commonly misunderstood books of the Bible. It's just caused a lot of confusion for a lot of people. There's some who have tried to interpret different visions and symbols as world powers and religious systems that have existed since this country has existed, since the beginning of America, trying to make it all apply to modern times. And so there's a vast array of applications that many have grown out of this book, have applied from this book, that really have nothing to do with the original message and intention of this book. We need to be careful with our applications and careful with how we approach the Word of God. Rather than trying to make it apply to our modern times, we need to make our modern times apply back to the Word of God. The word Revelation comes from the Greek word apocalypsis, which means unveiling, uncovering, revealing, and making fully known. The intention of the book is not to deceive, but it's meant to reveal the word, the message, the will of God. The book is written by the Apostle John, and he writes about things that he sees through the visions that are given to him. And so the expression "I saw" is found 37 times in this book. John is shown some incredible things through the book of Revelation. One way we're going to begin this study is just by considering 5 keys to understanding the book of Revelation. There are 5 important keys to navigating through this book. The first key is the specific audience. The book of Revelation is written to a specific group of people. The book of Revelation was written to the 7 churches of Asia. It's found in chapter 1 and verse 4, verse 11, and chapter 22 and verse 16. And so any interpretation that would prove to be meaningless to the original intended audience really should be questioned. It wasn't written to you and I, it was written to them who lived in that time. The second key is a specific setting. And there were certain circumstances which prompted the message of Revelation. The Christians were being persecuted by Jews and by Romans. And so there were great trials these disciples were facing, even to the point of death. You need to remember that. The third key is a specific timetable. And the book of Revelation is a prophecy about future events. The question we should ask is, how far in the future is the prophecy? And when you look at passages like chapter 1 and verse 1, where it says the things which must soon take place, or chapter 1 and verse 3, where it says that the time is near, or chapter 22 and verse 10, where it says the time is near. And then these statements identify that the timetable of this book and the things that are going to take place in this book was short. It was shorter rather than longer. In fact, the majority of this book has already taken place. It wasn't pointing to things that were thousands of years in the future. Rather, it was pointing to things that were soon to pass within the time it was written. Fourthly, is a specific writing style. The book is written in apocalyptic literature, which means it is written in signs and symbols. In fact, in chapter 1 and verse 1, it says that the book is signified or communicated. That's the Greek word semanio, and it means to give a sign. It's figurative. It's symbolic. What that means is as we approach the book and read through the details, the different visions and signs in the book, the things we read are not to be taken as literal unless really it's told that it's literal, that we are told to take it as literal. What we read is to be understood as that which represents something else, other things. And so the use of numbers, for example, or colors, they're used to indicate other things. It's not a literal understanding, but a figurative. We are shown amazing pictures to convey, to illustrate, to point us to other things. And then there is a specific purpose of the book. The book of Revelation was written to Christians who were suffering because of their faith. Some were killed and some were frightened. The enemy, Satan, was using a great force to accomplish his will. And thus this book is written to Christians, calling for them to overcome. Jesus will win. Satan and his forces will lose. And so this main theme echoed throughout the book, all through the 7 letters to the churches. And in the end of the book, in chapter 1 and verse 7, 21 and verse 7, is this call for Christians to overcome. Well, a lot has happened by the time we get to chapter 20. Remember, the goal of Satan from chapter 12 and verse 17 is to wage war with God's people. And he sought this through the means of his, we might call them his workers, his minions. They're described in this book as a land beast, a sea beast, and a great harlot. If you understand the history of the book, it's very likely that this was written around 90 AD. We're looking at a time period when the Roman Empire was strongly persecuting God's people, strongly persecuting Christians. The emperors at that time, especially Emperor Domitian, made it clear that the citizens of his empire will worship his image. Well, that comes into direct conflict with God's people because the only one we worship is God, is King Jesus. So can you imagine going to the marketplace and you're going to buy your food for the day, but before you can purchase your food, you have to show a certificate proving that you had offered a pinch of incense to an image of the Caesar. I mean, how would you live? How would you survive? Well, that's what these Christians were facing, because most of them didn't. These Christians stood up for their faith, remained steadfast in their walk with Christ, and their commitment to Christ, and thus many of them were imprisoned, and many of them were put to death horrifically by the sword, by crucifixion, or even as depicted on the screen, put in colosseums and eaten by animals, just a means of entertainment for their wicked captors. Well, what takes place in through the book, described through different images, is not just the working of Satan, the great dragon, and his beasts and his minions, the different workings of the Roman empires and their leaders. What takes place then is that the enemies are defeated. In chapter 17 and 18, the great harlot has been judged and defeated. In chapter 19, the 2 beasts have been destroyed. The only enemy left would be Satan, would be the great dragon, and that's what takes place in chapter 20. There's 3 major events that take place in chapter 20. The first of which, through verses 1 through 3, is the binding of Satan. To bind is to constrict. You get the idea of tying something up. What's it mean to bind Satan? Well, verse 3, he's no longer able to deceive the nations. I mean, through Satan, an entire nation was used against Christians. The Roman Empire, it was used as this destructive force against Christians. It's not to say that the dragon isn't active. I mean, we know that he still is today. I mean, 1 Peter 5, verse 8, he's a roaring lion seeking to devour God's people. What it means here is that he's going to be restricted for a period of time. 1,000 years, again, remember, it's not to be taken as literal. Remember, it's a figurative book. It's apocalyptic literature. And so you see numbers, you see colors, and they're representative. And so 1,000 years does not mean a literal 1,000 years. These numbers are symbolic. It could be that the number 1,000 is representing a number of completion, the idea of completion. You look at Psalm 50 and verse 10 or Psalm 84 and verse 10. And verses 4 through 6, there's a description of the resurrection of martyrs who will reign with Christ for 1,000 years. It's likely referring to the spiritual resurrection that takes place when a soul dies with Christ and then is raised to a new life. You think of that Romans 6 and verse 4, raised to walk in the newness of life. And that's really what takes place as a vindication of faith. Could also be that it's pointing to the resurrection of a cause, that the second death will have no power over them. And you can sort of see that pointed to in chapter 2 and verse 11, chapter 20 and verse 14, and chapter 21 and verse 8. Then the end of the chapter points to how Satan will be released and defeated, verses 7 through 10. He's going to come out to deceive the nations once more, verse 8. And with them we find named here Gog and Magog. You can find those names found in Ezekiel 38, verse 2, and 39 and verse 1. He was the leader of the enemies of God's people those years ago. Ezekiel prophesied against them and foretold his defeat at the hands of God. And so the representing here, it's not that they're going to be resurrected back to life, but these names are representing the enemy of God's people. They are going to be defeated in verse 9. Satan rallying up his his attack against God's people, the enemies will be defeated, and the Satan in verse 10 will be tormented forever and ever in the lake of fire. Now remember something, as you look at these details of the enemies that are listed here, of Satan, of the great chain, of the 1,000 years, of the key to the abyss, the mark on the forehead, the lake of fire, everything that's mentioned here, remember that all of this needs to keep the integrity and the focus of this book. It's still apocalyptic, which means when we read these things, we're not to think a literal lake of fire, a literal chain, a literal key to the abyss. The book is pointing to us the great conflict which has been since the very beginning between Satan and God's people, and how it finally will come to an end. Satan will be defeated. He will be punished. He will be sent into everlasting punishment. Matthew 25 confirms that. That's what this chapter is describing. I mean, you notice what's not found in this chapter. We don't find a description that we're going to reign with Christ for 1,000 years. We don't find mention the second coming of Jesus. We don't find mention Jerusalem or Jesus' reign happening on earth. And that's part of the problem, is that some have looked at this chapter through a literal lens and drawn some literal applications that misses the point of the chapter. There's some who think that Jesus, when he came to earth, he was going to establish a physical kingdom among men, but the people rejected him. And so as an afterthought, he set up the church. And then they look at this chapter and they think that Jesus is going to come, but only for his people. He's going to meet them in the air, and they're going to be together for 7 years during the great tribulation on the earth. And then this is the idea of the rapture. The saints will be taken up with Christ, but then Jesus will come with his saints, and there will be this great battle, the battle of Armageddon. The wicked will be dealt with. Satan will be bound and sealed in the pit. The saints will be judged. The kingdom will be established. Christ will ascend to the throne. In the fleshly house of Israel, the Jews will return. Jesus will reign for 1,000 years on the earth. There's going to be a time of peace. But then after the 1,000 years, there's going to be a judgment of the wicked who are raised, and then they'll be separated to heaven and hell. The problem is that while that makes good literature, certainly paints a fascinating story, you have to have a literal understanding of Revelation 12 to get there. You have to have a literal taking of the book of Revelation to get there, and the whole book isn't literal. There's no way it is. Otherwise, we'd have a dragon in outer space wiping out stars with his tail. We understand from the very outset that this book was written to God's people facing a specific conflict in a specific time, and we're to look at all of these images as simply that. Images, dreams, figures, signs pointing us to a spiritual reality, a spiritual truth, things that are to come. And Revelation 20 is but the end of a conflict, of the great conflict that chapter 12 describes of Revelation, the conflict that has existed from the beginning of time between Satan and God's people. And while there will come a time when he's bound, and a time when he is defeated, when he tries to rally against God's people, the point of the chapter is describing how Satan will be dealt with, he will be judged, and he will be defeated, as will those who side with him. Anyone's name not found written in the book of life was thrown into the lake of fire, it says in Revelation 20, verse 15. Well, the other chapter that we're going to be considering is Matthew chapter 24. Matthew 24. Matthew 24 is another difficult chapter. This chapter has caused a lot of controversy over end-time subjects. Many believe it's talking purely about the second coming of Jesus, and so it's important to understand what this chapter has to say as well. So just as we did with the book of Revelation, let's just consider a few keys to helping us understand this chapter. One is the use of apocalyptic literature. Just like the book of Revelation, Jesus employs here a highly symbolic and figurative type of language. In fact, we'll see in a moment how Jesus reflects upon the language of the prophets as he's describing the things that are to come. And the prophets used a very symbolic, a very vivid way of describing the judgment of the Lord. And that's our second point, is the use of Old Testament symbols and prophetic imagery. Jesus uses several phrases that just come right out of the prophets. And so seeing them in their context can help us understand what Jesus is meaning here. I think a third key is context. Context, context, context. We need to know the context and keep the context. And we're going to establish that context here in just a moment. And then what also helps us is just understanding the other accounts. Is the same teaching is echoed in Mark 13 and in Luke 21. And so if we look at all three of them together, it helps paint a more accurate picture of what is being taught here. Sort of to catch the context of Matthew 24, you just go back a little bit and kind of walk up to this chapter. So in chapter 21 of the book of Matthew, Jesus is entering into Jerusalem. You have the triumphal entrance and Jesus cleansing the temple, and then he leaves for the evening and heads to Bethany. He returns the next day in 18 to 22. In the next day to Jerusalem, and in chapter 23, Jesus enters the temple and begins to teach. So chapter 22 and 23 of the book of Matthew covers different teachings of Jesus while in the temple. In Matthew chapter 24, it says in Matthew 24 in verse 1, Jesus came out from the temple and was going away when his disciples came up to point out the temple buildings to him. And so they are pointing out the temples. In fact, in Mark 13, verse 1, they say, what beautiful stones, what beautiful buildings. Luke 21, verse 5, some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts. And so the idea is Jesus has been spending this time here in Jerusalem, nearing the end of his time on earth, his time before the cross. And so now that they have spent time in the temple, as they exit, the apostles are pointing Jesus' attention to this incredible temple building. And Herod's temple was incredible. It covered 36 acres. It measured 37 feet long, 12 feet high, 18 feet thick. It was made of white, brilliant stones. It could hold 200,000 people. It took 46 years to build, it says in John 2 verse 20. And so it seemed very permanent. So you can imagine how Jesus' statement in verse 2, when he says, do you not see all these things? Surely I say to you that not one stone here will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. When you think about the temple, how great it was, how tall it was, how massive it was, you can just imagine how devastating that phrase would be. I mean, it would seem devastating physically. I mean, this is a massive structure. And so Jesus saying that not one stone will be left on another must mean that this must be some incredible calamity. But that's also devastating spiritually, in that the temple was significant to the Jews, to the entire Jewish nation. It was a represented place of God's presence among the people. It was a place of worship. Well, there's a question. Jesus and his disciples go to the Mount of Olives, where his apostles ask him a question about the things that he had said. And these questions are important to understanding what the chapter are about. And so Matthew's account says, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives, his disciples came to him privately saying, tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Mark's account says, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? And then Luke records it as, teacher, when therefore will these things be, and what will be the sign when these things are about to take place? So what they're asking is that they all use the phrase these things. They're referring to what Jesus just said about the temple. So there seems to be two questions they're asking. When are these things going to happen? And what signs are going to accompany these things? How are we going to know when they are about to occur? Jesus then sets out to answer their questions. He starts by sharing with them false signs which will appear. False signs that they will aware, and so that they will not be misled. The false signs are false Christ, rumors of wars, famines and earthquakes, persecutions, and apostasies. These things are going to happen, but just because these things are happening does not mean that what I talked about is about to happen. Before this great event would happen and the destruction of the temple, it says that the gospel would be preached to the whole world in verse 14. And you can compare that with what Paul says in the book of Colossians 1 and verse 6 and in verse 23. And then he says the sign that these things will begin to occur is the abomination of desolation. It's found in verse 15. Well, think about what these words mean. Abomination means a detestable thing, sacrilegious. And a desolation means to lay waste. The phrase is found, let me put these up here. The phrase is found in Daniel 9, verse 27, Daniel 11:31, and Daniel 12 and verse 11. And so Daniel is written centuries before Matthew. And thus Jesus is describing this fulfillment of what Daniel pointed to. What is the abomination of desolation? Consider these two passages on the screen. Mark 13 and verse 14. When you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be. And then Luke 21 and verse 20. When you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then recognize that her desolation is near. These two passages are referring to Roman armies standing where they do not belong, either in the temple itself or in Jerusalem, even in Judea, the holy place, the holy city, and the holy land. This was the sign these things are about to take place, because Rome was going to come and destroy Jerusalem. And because they were, Jesus' instructions are to flee. To flee for safety, verses 16 to 22. Verse 16, flee to the mountains. Verse 17, those in the field must not go down to get things in their house. Verse 18, whoever's in the field, don't turn back to go get your coat. Verse 19, woe to those who are pregnant and nursing. What a difficulty it would be to flee in such circumstances. Verse 20, pray that it's not going to be winter time. That'd be difficult traveling conditions. Verse 20, pray it's not on the Sabbath. The Jews would enforce their Sabbath rules, closing the gates, keeping people from leaving. That was instilled during the time of Nehemiah, that they would close the gates to keep people from the markets. You can look that up in Nehemiah 13 and verse 19. And so pray it's not in the Sabbath, that they will be able to leave. You see, the reasons they were to flee was due to the nature of the destruction coming upon the city. In verse 21, it says that there will be a great tribulation such as not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. The Roman invasion and destruction of Jerusalem was so intense, there's been nothing like it. In AD 66, when the governor of Judea, Florus, when he robbed the temple to fund the building projects, the Jews revolted and rebelled. And so Nero sent Gallius to suppress that uprising. Jerusalem was surrounded in AD 66. Vespasian becomes the emperor, and he sends his son Titus to conquer Jerusalem. The city was surrounded for 5 months. Any Jews outside the city were killed. Hundreds were crucified. The blockade caused a famine, and it was so severe, that famine was so severe, that it said that mothers even ate their own children. When the battle took place, the temple courts flowed with blood like a river. It said that 1.1 million Jews were killed. Horrific. Well, after the tribulation, what's described here is some language that's taken straight out of the Old Testament. I'm going to refer to them here. I'll put them on the screen, and you can look them up in your own time. We find that the sun is going to be dark, and the stars falling from the sky, and the moon not giving its light, shaking powers from the heavens. It's a figurative description for the departing glory of God. Look at the references of Isaiah and Ezekiel and Joel. It's describing the end or the fading of the Jewish nation and culture and land. What once shined and stood brightly is now going to fade and fall. There's the image of the Son of Man coming on the cloud. Some think of this as Jesus' return, but really this language is used to describe God coming, symbolic of judgment, and thus Jesus coming is referring to his presence and the destruction of Jerusalem. Look at Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel's reference to that language. There's the angels of the four winds gathering the elect. There will not just be one nation, but the gospel is spread to all the four corners of the earth, and the angels and messengers who will bring this about are us. It's not angels. We are, in a sense, angels in terms of messengers or servants of God, Christians. Well, when will this all occur? It says in verse 32, now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts in its leaves, you know that summer is near. Even so, you too, when you see all these things, recognize that he is near, right at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. When they saw such things, they knew it was to occur. When they saw the evidence, when they saw, as it says here, from the tree, from the fruits from the tree, you'll recognize the signs, it's near. Verse 34 makes it clear, this generation will not pass away until these things take place. That's a large part of this chapter is describing the destruction that will come about on Jerusalem in AD 70. Up to this point, through verse 34, everything that has been written and described here is pointing to the destruction of Jerusalem, not the second coming of Jesus. Now, it could be, when you look at verse 35 to 36, that there be a change in thought, a change in subject. Compare those days with that day, those days in verse 19 and verse 22 and verse 29, with the describing language of that day from 36, 25:1 and 25 and verse 13. For the day, but in that day and those days. When you consider the nature of those days, you see the images of armies and masses of refugees and destruction, of falling stars and veering planets. But then after 35 and 36, we find weddings and plowings and milling and sleeping. I mean, it seems to be a shift in subject, especially considering how chapter 25 begins describing his second coming and the end of time. How his coming will be like the days of Noah in verse 37 through 39. And those days, they were told about destruction through the flood, and yet they did what they wanted. They did as they were pleased. They were caught unaware by God's wrath. And the same will be for us today. We are warned that Jesus will return, and yet people are going to just keep on living carelessly, unprepared for his coming. The idea in verse 40 and 41 that some will be taken and some will be left. Some say these verses are in favor of a rapture, but that's not the case. Instead, it seems to be describing the separation, perhaps in judgment, that will take place. As you see in chapter 25, one taken and one left could be in life. One is alive, one is dead, but it could also be in judgment. Could also be in the destruction of Jerusalem. That perhaps there's not a change in thought. That perhaps everything that's described from verse 36 down to verse 51 is still describing the destruction of Jerusalem. Jesus ends this chapter with a parable about being prepared in verse 42 to 51. We don't know when the day is going to come or when our last day will be, so we need to live prepared and ready for when it does come. Do you kind of see the point that we've been through looking at these two chapters, Revelation 20 and in Matthew 24? In Revelation 20, it doesn't mention a literal reign on the earth for a literal 1,000 years. It's a scene of the final judgment of Satan and then the wicked. Most of these views come from misinterpreting Bible texts in their context. Both of these chapters are a great illustration of 2 Timothy 2 and verse 15, that we must prove ourselves to be diligent students of the Word of God, to handle these words carefully and accurately. It doesn't mean that every study is going to be easy and that every chapter of the Bible is going to be easy to understand. But it does mean that we need to do our best to try and understand each passage in their context, to apply them first to their original audience before we try and apply them to ourselves, and to make sure that what we read aligns with what we have read elsewhere in Scripture, the whole of God's Word. Neither Revelation 20 nor Matthew 24 are used to as can be properly used as evidences for beliefs such as premillennialism, which will be the focus of our next study, and I invite you back to the study with us. I encourage you to go back and to look at these chapters, to look at them with the tools that we have employed this study, and to see if you can make sense of these chapters in their context towards the original audiences they were given. If you have any thoughts or questions over this study, I encourage you to reach out. I'd love to hear back from you. Thank you so much for spending these few minutes together with me. Hope you have a wonderful day. Join us again as we take our time and we go through this great study of life after death.